It was early 1943, and the skies over Europe had become a deadly chessboard. On one side, the Allied bombers, massive lumbering giants, were clawing their way deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. On the other, the Luftwaffe's sleek fighters waited like hawks, diving from the clouds with ruthless precision. But amid the chaos, there was one aircraft that began to earn an almost mythical reputation: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. To the Americans who flew her, she was a symbol of power and resilience. To the Germans who tried to shoot her down, she was a nightmare, a flying fortress indeed. And soon, some of those Luftwaffe officers would get a closer look than they ever imagined. It started one cold morning over occupied France. A formation of B-17s from the U.S. 8th Air Force thundered to the thin layer of clouds, engines roaring in perfect synchrony. Their target, an industrial complex near Bremen. But as always, the Germans were ready. Radar picked up their movement miles away, and soon the cry went out: Feindlich bomber in Anflug. Enemy bombers incoming. Within minutes, dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were scrambled into the air. The sky turned into chaos. Tracer rounds, flak explosions, and the deep rumble of four massive Wright Cyclone engines battling to stay aloft. Somewhere in that deadly dance, one B-17 took a direct hit. Its tail was shredded, one engine sputtered in flames, and smoke poured from the fuselage. But somehow, the crew managed to steady her. They dumped altitude, limped across the coast, and tried desperately to make it back to England. They didn't make it. German spotters on the ground watched as the crippled bomber dropped lower and lower, finally crash-landing in a field near Melun, south of Paris. To the villagers nearby, it was a terrifying sight. But to the Luftwaffe officers who arrived soon after, it was something else entirely, a rare gift from the skies. When German engineers and intelligence officers reached the wreckage, they could hardly believe what they saw. Despite the damage, the aircraft's frame was mostly intact. The crew had been captured or killed, and now the Luftwaffe had something they wanted for months: a complete operational B-17 Flying Fortress. They called it the prize of the year. The aircraft was carefully towed, piece by piece, to a Luftwaffe testing center in Rechlin, Germany's equivalent of America's Wright Field. There, mechanics and flight engineers began the painstaking process of repairing it. They patched holes, replaced shattered glass, and repainted the tail to disguise it. Soon, the captured B-17 was airworthy again. Its silver American markings were replaced with the black cross of the Luftwaffe, and its new German identification code was added to the fuselage. It was now officially part of the Luftwaffe's Butte, a trophy aircraft. But flying this machine would be something entirely different. The B-17 was unlike anything most German pilots had ever handled. It was huge, heavy, and bristling with guns. From the ground, it looked slow and clumsy. But the more they studied it, the more the Luftwaffe engineers realized something remarkable. The Flying Fortress wasn't just a bomber. It was a weaponized ecosystem in the sky. Each gun turret, each armored section, and each position inside the aircraft had been designed with one thing in mind: survival. From nose to tail, it carried up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each with its own field of fire, overlapping to create a deadly defensive web. No angle was truly safe. If a German fighter tried to sneak up behind it, the tail gunner would be waiting. If it attacked from the front, it faced twin guns in the nose and chin turret. Even from above or below, there was a deadly surprise waiting. Either the top turret or the ball turret gunner, both with a clear view and steady aim. When Luftwaffe officers climbed into the cockpit for the first time, they were stunned by its size. The B-17's control panel stretched wide, filled with dials and gauges. Its yoke felt more like a steering wheel from a truck than a fighter control stick. And yet, when they fired the engines and felt the deep vibration of those four massive cyclones, they realized just how solid this aircraft was. Test flights began in secret. A select group of Luftwaffe pilots, some of the best in Germany, were assigned to fly the captured bomber and record their findings. One of them, Hauptmann Hans Werner, was particularly curious. He had flown dozens of Allied aircraft before, Spitfires, Mustangs, even AP-38, but this B-17 felt different. As he eased it down the runway for the first time, he felt its immense power surge through the airframe. The takeoff was surprisingly smooth, the climb steady and strong. The controls were heavy, yes, but responsive. It felt reliable. During those first test flights, German engineers stood below, taking notes, measuring engine output, and timing its performance. They wanted to know everything: the aircraft's top speed, turning radius, ceiling, and defensive strength. But what truly fascinated them wasn't the speed or agility. It was how much punishment the Flying Fortress could take and still keep flying. When they studied the wreckage of other downed B-17s, they saw the same thing over and over: gaping holes in the wings, shredded control surfaces, burnt-out engines. And yet the planes had still managed to stay in the air long enough for their crews to bail out or crash land safely. It was unheard of. The Luftwaffe had never seen anything like it. And now, flying this one for themselves, they finally understood why the Americans were sending them in daylight raids again and again. These weren't ordinary bombers. They were fortresses that fought back. But what truly shocked them came later, when they simulated combat scenarios. German test pilots brought the captured B-17 into mock dogfights with friendly aircraft, letting other Luftwaffe pilots attack from various angles to see how its gunners could respond. Even without live ammunition, it was clear that the overlapping arcs of fire made it nearly impossible for a single fighter to approach without getting caught in a storm of bullets. One of the Luftwaffe officers later admitted, "We had never seen defensive firepower like it. It was madness to attack such a machine head-on, and yet that's what our young pilots were being told to do." That revelation changed everything. The Luftwaffe began adjusting their attack patterns against American bomber formations, developing new tactics to exploit weaknesses in the B-17's coverage. But even with that knowledge, they couldn't deny what they had just learned. The Flying Fortress was a masterpiece of survival engineering. It wasn't fast. It wasn't pretty. But it was built to endure, and that made it terrifying. As the months went on, that single captured B-17 became one of the most studied aircraft in Germany. Every inch was photographed, every system documented. Its defensive power left such an impression that even after the war, surviving Luftwaffe officers still spoke of it with a mix of admiration and disbelief. But there was one story that few knew, an incident during one of those test flights where the captured bomber nearly didn't come back, and what the German crew experienced that day changed their view of the Flying Fortress forever. The morning air over Rechlin was cold and biting. A thin layer of mist clung to the airfield as a group of Luftwaffe engineers gathered near the hangar. Before them stood the captured B-17, gleaming under a coat of fresh paint. Gone were the American stars. In their place, the dark Balkenkreuz. A strange sight indeed, an American bomber now carrying German markings, its engines warming up under the supervision of men who, not long ago, had tried to shoot it down. The test flight that day was supposed to be routine, a systems check, nothing more. But fate had other plans. At the controls sat Hauptmann Hans Werner Lurk, one of Germany's most experienced test pilots. He had flown nearly every aircraft that came into German hands, Allied and Axis alike. But even he admitted the B-17 was something special. It didn't feel like flying a machine. It felt like commanding a battleship in the sky. As the engines roared to life, the runway trembled beneath the weight. Lurk eased the throttles forward. The bomber lumbered ahead, gathering speed. The vibration deepened. Then suddenly, she lifted, breaking free from the ground with grace that didn't match her size. The crew inside exchanged glances. This was no clumsy beast. It was steady, balanced, and surprisingly agile for its weight. Up in the air, Lurk banked the aircraft left, then right, testing its stability. Even at steep angles, the Fortress held firm. He radioed down to the control tower, his voice calm. Flugverhalten stable. Controls responsive. The engineers below noted everything. Every degree of pitch, every second of climb rate. They wanted to understand what made this bomber so formidable. Then came the part everyone was waiting for, the defensive test. The B-17's gun positions had been fitted with cameras in place of live weapons. German fighter pilots would attack from multiple directions, simulating real combat maneuvers. The goal was simple: find the weaknesses in the fortress's coverage. For Messerschmitt Bf 109s formed up around the bomber. Their pilots, veterans of countless missions, grinned inside their cockpits. This was their chance to see the American flying fortress up close, without the danger of being shredded by .50 caliber fire. Or so they thought. The mock battle began. The Bf 109s dove from above, one after another, slicing to the thin clouds. From the bomber's perspective, they appeared suddenly, like predatory birds closing in on prey. But as soon as they reached attack range, something remarkable happened. The cameras installed in the gun turrets caught them all, perfectly centered in the gunner's field of fire. The top turret's twin guns tracked the attackers effortlessly. The tail gun followed the dive of a Messerschmitt, trying to circle behind. The chin turret locked on to another coming from low in front. Even with no bullets flying, the message was clear. Any real attack would have ended in disaster for fighters. Back on the ground, the Luftwaffe officers gathered around the footage. They replayed the film over and over, stunned by how few safe angles existed. One pilot muttered, "Das ist Wahnsinn, this is madness." Another simply shook his head and said, "Now I understand why our young men call it the flying porcupine." What amazed them most wasn't just the gun coverage. It was how each station was placed for maximum teamwork. Every gunner had overlapping fire zones. The B-17 wasn't built for one man's defense. It was built for cooperation. 10 men working as one unit, each protecting the other. German engineers began mapping out every angle, every blind spot. They discovered only 2 areas where the fortress was relatively vulnerable, directly beneath the tail and a narrow cone above the nose. But even then, the danger of crossfire made approaching those zones risky. This revelation changed Luftwaffe tactics almost overnight. Instead of attacking head-on, they began experimenting with belly attacks, using steep dives of fire into those weaker areas before quickly breaking away. But even then, success was never guaranteed. What impressed the Luftwaffe officers most, however, was the bomber's design philosophy. Unlike German bombers, which prioritized speed and bomb load, the B-17 was built to survive damage. Its structure was reinforced with multiple spars and overlapping aluminum plates. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the crew compartments were surrounded by armor. The Germans found that even with 2 engines disabled, the flying fortress could stay aloft and return home. In one test, Lurk deliberately shut down an engine mid-flight, then another. The B-17 still flew, sluggishly but steadily. When he landed, he turned to the engineers and said with a grin, "You could shoot this thing half to pieces and it would still bring you home." That resilience became legendary among Allied crews, and even respected by their enemies. German pilots began reporting incredible encounters. Stories spread across squadrons. Tales of B-17s flying back to England with wings shredded, engines smoking, even tails nearly torn off. One Luftwaffe ace recalled seeing a fortress flying with one entire stabilizer missing. "It should not have been possible," he said later, and yet it kept going. The psychological impact was enormous. For many Luftwaffe pilots, the B-17 came to symbolize American industrial might, machines built in such numbers, so ruggedly, that even destruction felt futile. For the first time, some began to sense that Germany was fighting not just against men, but against a manufacturing empire. But not all lessons came from admiration. Some were born of fear. During one of the later test flights, the captured B-17 nearly met its end. A mechanical failure struck one of its engines midair, causing a sudden fire. Lurk and his co-pilot reacted instantly, cutting fuel flow and pulling the fire extinguisher controls. Smoke filled the cockpit as the heavy aircraft began to lose altitude. For a brief moment, everyone aboard thought they were finished. But the B-17 refused to die. Even with one wing scorched and the propeller locked in place, the fortress held its balance. Lurk guided it down with steady hands, eyes focused on the tree line below. They barely cleared the forest and managed to bring it down on a rough emergency strip. The crew climbed out, coughing, faces blackened with soot but alive. The engineers who examined the damage were stunned. The fire had burned through wiring and control lines, yet the redundancy systems had kept the bomber operational. That day, the Luftwaffe officers stopped seeing the B-17 as just a piece of enemy technology. They saw it as a triumph of design, one they couldn't replicate. Even years later, many of them would confess their grudging respect for the Flying Fortress. Some even compared it to Germany's own Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, another four-engine machine, but admitted the American aircraft was far superior in defense and reliability. The Luftwaffe continued flying the captured B-17 for months, testing it against their newest fighters and refining interception tactics. Yet despite all their knowledge, they could never completely neutralize its power. The bomber crews who flew from England every morning were well aware of the dangers, but they also knew they sat inside something extraordinary, a fortress in the sky that the enemy had studied, feared, and could never truly overcome. Still, the story wasn't over. One final mission, an unauthorized test flight, would take this captured B-17 beyond the limits of reason, and what happened next would leave even the most hardened Luftwaffe officers speechless. By late 1943, the skies over Europe were filled with smoke and fire. Allied bombers streamed across the continent in endless waves, hammering German factories, oil plants, and rail lines. The Luftwaffe was being stretched thin, its pilots flying mission after mission, often against impossible odds. And somewhere deep in Germany, that single captured B-17, the pride of the test center at Rechlin, still stood as both a mystery and a mirror. It represented everything the Germans feared and everything they respected. But one morning, that bomber story took a turn no one expected. The airfield was quiet when Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurk received a last-minute order. The High Command wanted the B-17 flown on a long-range endurance test, to push it farther than any previous flight. The mission: simulate an Allied deep penetration raid and return with data on fuel efficiency, altitude performance, and navigation systems. On paper, it was routine, but in the air, it became something far more dangerous. Lurk took off just after dawn. The four Wright Cyclones roared to life, and the silver giant lifted into the pale German sky. His co-pilot was Oberleutnant Fritz Simon, another test pilot with a calm hand and nerves of steel. As they climbed through the clouds, the world below turned into a patchwork of dark forests and mist-covered lakes. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Then, without warning, the radio crackled with a sharp voice, an urgent call from ground control. Unidentified aircraft approaching from the northwest. Possibly enemy reconnaissance. Lurk frowned. Allied intruders this deep into Germany were rare, but not impossible. He adjusted the B-17's course slightly, hoping to avoid contact. But luck was not on his side. Moments later, dark specks appeared in the distance, growing larger, faster. 4 RAF Spitfires, on a cross-border patrol, had spotted the bomber. Through their lenses, the round silhouette of a 4-engine aircraft, high and silver against the morning sun, looked exactly like every other American fortress they'd been trained to intercept. None of them could see the black German crosses painted faintly on its wings. They were coming straight for him. Inside the cockpit, Lurk's heart began to pound. He grabbed the radio microphone, trying to switch frequencies, but no Allied pilot would be listening. "Verdammt," he muttered. There was no way to communicate. The British fighters thought they'd just caught an American bomber returning from a raid, and they were preparing to attack. The first Spitfire made a diving pass. Tracers streaked by the nose, slicing through the thin air. The sound of bullets clanging off the fuselage echoed through the cabin. The B-17 shuddered violently. Lurk's instincts took over. He shoved the throttles forward and banked hard left, feeling the massive bomber groan under the strain. The Spitfires circled like wolves, lining up for another run. From the ground, radar operators could only watch as the German-captured fortress vanished from a main screen. Communication was lost. For the next 10 minutes, the B-17 fought for its life, not with guns, but with maneuvering and raw power. Lurk pushed the engines to their limits, diving into cloud banks, climbing through turbulence, anything to shake his pursuers. The British pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. "This one's not going down," one shouted over the radio. "He's flying like a fighter." In the chaos, a burst of gunfire ripped through the right wing, severing the control line. Smoke trailed behind as the outer engine sputtered and died. The fortress began to roll. Lurk gritted his teeth, both hands gripping the yoke, muscles straining. "Hold on, Fritz," he shouted. "We're not done yet." At barely 2,000 feet, they broke through the cloud base, and below them lay a stretch of open farmland. Lurk knew it was their only chance. With one engine gone and fuel pouring out, they couldn't make it back to Rechlin. He leveled the wings, dropped the landing gear manually, and aimed for a field just beyond a small cluster of trees. The touchdown was brutal. The left wheel struck first, snapping under the weight. The bomber skidded, tore through the soil, and came to a grinding halt in a shower of dirt and smoke. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. When German soldiers arrived hours later, they found Lurk and his co-pilot alive but shaken, sitting beside the wreck with their flight jackets blackened by smoke. The Spitfires had long disappeared. They had assumed their target was destroyed. As engineers examined the wreckage, one detail stood out, the same as always. Despite being hit by cannon shells, losing an engine, and suffering hydraulic failure, the B-17 had still managed to bring its crew safely down. Once again, it had lived up to its name. The Flying Fortress had refused to die. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread quietly through Luftwaffe ranks. Officers who had once mocked the bulky American bomber now spoke of it with awe. Some even compared it to a force of nature, unstoppable, unyielding, and built with a purpose beyond imagination. One German pilot who saw the wreck reportedly said, "If this is how they build their bombers, I don't want to meet their fighters." But the story of the captured B-17 didn't end there. The remains of the aircraft were salvaged and studied one last time before being scrapped. Its engines were disassembled, its control systems photographed, its armor plates measured. Everything it taught the Luftwaffe was recorded, analyzed, and filed away. Yet despite all the data, one truth remained. No amount of study could reproduce the spirit that powered those machines, or the men inside them. For the Americans, the Flying Fortress became more than just a bomber. It was a symbol of endurance. Crews would gather before missions, tracing their fingers along the bullet holes patched over with silver tape, knowing those scars meant survival. They trusted their aircraft with their lives, and time after time, it brought them home. Many airmen later said that when they flew AB-17, they didn't feel like they were fighting in a machine. They felt like they were fighting with one, as if it had a soul of its own. When the war finally ended and peace returned to the skies, both sides remembered the B-17, the Allies for its bravery, the Germans for its power. And those few Luftwaffe officers who once flew the captured fortress never forgot the experience. They had looked their enemy's weapon in the eye and found not just fear, but respect. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, some of them spoke candidly about that time. One former test pilot admitted, "When we flew it, we understood why our fighters were dying. It wasn't just a bomber. It was a fortress that fought back." Another added quietly, "It was the first time I felt the war was already lost." Today, the legend of the Flying Fortress lives on, in museums, air shows, and the memories of those who survived the brutal air battles of World War II. Its shape, its sound, and its spirit stand as a reminder of an era when courage was measured not just by how you fought, but by how much you could endure.